Under duress. The covenant that never was.
Under Duress Part 1. The Covenant That Never Was. Under Duress Part 2. The Theology of Consent. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 30th, 2026. Part 2. The Theology of Consent. Chapter 6. Baptism, Confirmation and Free Will. No institution in human history has spoken more fluently about covenant than religion, and no institution has accumulated a richer vocabulary for describing the precise conditions under which agreement becomes sacred rather than merely binding. This makes religion the ideal proving ground for the framework built across Part 1. Not because religion is uniquely guilty of converting coercion into consent, but because religion is uniquely articulate about the difference, having spent millennia developing doctrine specifically to protect it. If the framework holds anywhere, it should hold here, against an institution that built its own internal jurisprudence around exactly this question. The verdict, examined honestly, is mixed in instructive ways. Religious traditions did not fail to understand the requirements of genuine consent. They understood them with remarkable precision. What happened instead, in case after case, was the same pattern observed throughout Part 1. Doctrine built around an ideal of free consent gradually accommodated to institutional convenience, until ritual performed in infancy or under total social dependency came to be treated as functionally equivalent to consent freely given by a sovereign adult. Not because anyone decided the two were equivalent, but because the gap between them became inconvenient to examine. The doctrine was never naive. Begin with what Christian sacramental theology actually required, in its careful technical form, because the careful form is more demanding than its popular practice ever became. Canon law developed an extensive doctrine around the conditions necessary for valid sacramental consent, particularly around marriage, where the requirement was stated with a clarity many secular legal systems still have not matched. Consent must be free, fully informed, and given by a party with the use of reason sufficient to understand what was being undertaken. A marriage entered under grave fear, vis et metus again, the same Roman category examined in Chapter 2, absorbed directly into ecclesiastical jurisprudence, was not merely regrettable. It was theologically void, capable of annulment, because the sacrament required something coercion could never produce, an interior act of the will, not merely an exterior performance of compliance. This is a genuinely demanding standard, more demanding in some respects than contemporary secular contract law, which as Chapter 2 demonstrated has narrowed its duress doctrine until almost nothing qualifies. Canon law, at its theological core, insisted that the externally observable ritual, vow spoken, hands joined, document signed, carried no sacramental weight whatsoever if the internal freedom required to make those externals meaningful was absent. A forced marriage performed with a smile, witnessed by the entire community, properly registered, was nonetheless nothing. Theologically, legally, sacramentally, nothing. Baptism received a parallel theological architecture, though pointed toward an entirely different problem. The Church distinguished sharply between baptism received by an adult capable of personal faith and baptism received by an infant incapable of any such thing, and the distinction was not glossed over or treated as a technicality. It was the subject of centuries of serious theological dispute precisely because the architects of the doctrine understood exactly what Part 1 has been arguing. A ritual performed on a party incapable of consent cannot draw its legitimacy from that party's consent. It must draw its legitimacy from somewhere else entirely, or it draws no legitimacy at all. Where the theology went. The somewhere else that infant baptism's legitimacy was relocated to is worth examining closely, because the relocation strategy recurs, almost identically, across every secular institution examined later in this book. The dominant theological solution was proxy consent. The faith of the parents, the godparents, and the believing community stood in for the faith the infant could not yet personally hold, with the explicit expectation that the infant would, upon reaching the age of reason, ratify this proxy arrangement through their own free assent, historically channeled through confirmation, a second sacrament specifically designed to be the moment at which the individual, now capable of genuine consent, personally claims what was provisionally extended on their behalf in infancy. This is, on its own theological terms, a coherent solution. It does not pretend the infant consented. It explicitly defers the question of genuine consent to a later moment when consent becomes possible, and it builds an entire second sacrament around formalizing that deferred moment. Measured against the three-part sovereignty test from Chapter 4, the capacity to know, to refuse, and to be recognized confirmation in its theological ideal is supposed to be the moment all three capacities are finally present and finally consulted. The trouble is what happens to confirmation in lived practice, across the overwhelming majority of historical and contemporary religious communities, where the typical confirmant has spent their entire conscious life embedded in family structures, social networks, educational institutions, and community identities all organized around the expectation that confirmation will occur. By the time the moment theoretically reserved for free ratification arrives, The candidate is rarely standing before a genuinely open choice. They are standing before a single socially survivable path, dressed in liturgical language, while the alternative public refusal, at an age where peer belonging and family approval carry maximal psychological weight, would constitute, for most adolescents in most communities, something close to the catastrophic exit cost Chapter 2 identified as the marker of structural duress. This is not a claim that confirmation is universally coerced, any more than Chapter 1 claimed every contract is illegitimate. It is the narrower, more precise claim that the theological architecture designed specifically to ensure genuine consent has, in the overwhelming majority of its lived applications, been quietly hollowed out by exactly the same mechanism Chapter 4 described, incapacity manufactured by the surrounding structure, then cited as irrelevant because the ritual occurred and a signature of sorts was obtained. The honest exceptions. It would distort the record to suggest no tradition grappled seriously with this problem. Several did, and their solutions are worth naming because they demonstrate the gap was not invisible to religious thought itself. Believers' baptism traditions, those insisting baptism occur only upon a personal profession of faith made by someone old enough to genuinely understand and freely choose it, developed explicitly as a doctrinal correction to exactly the proxy consent problem just described. Whatever their theological disputes with infant baptism traditions on other grounds, their underlying instinct tracks the sovereignty framework of Chapter 4 with real precision. A sacrament requiring consent should not be administered to a party structurally incapable of giving it. Quaker communities developed practices of waiting, discernment, and communal testing, specifically designed to slow down moments of significant commitment until the interior freedom required for genuine consent had time to actually form, rather than being assumed present the moment a ritual calendar called for it. These traditions remain minority practices within the broader landscape of organized religion, which is itself revealing. The theological insight that consent requires genuine capacity was always available. It was rarely the dominant institutional choice because the dominant institutional choice, infant initiation, ratified by a confirmation process embedded in total social dependency, produces vastly higher retention than any system that waits for fully sovereign adult choice before extending membership. Chapter 5's diagnostic question applies here with full force. An institution that requires no retention mechanism is one whose members are freely choosing it, repeatedly. An institution built around securing membership before the capacity for genuine refusal has fully formed is, whatever its theological self-understanding, behaving exactly like every other institution examined in this book that has learned the efficiency of obtaining agreement before sovereignty is fully present to contest it. What free will was actually protecting. It is worth pausing on why free will occupied such a central position in this theological architecture in the first place, because the reasoning illuminates something Part 1 approached from a secular angle but religious thought arrived at independently centuries earlier from a theological one. The traditions that placed heaviest emphasis on free will, and Christian theology in its mainstream forms placed enormous emphasis on it, treating coerced faith as not merely inferior but as not actually constituting faith at all, did so because they grasped something the entire argument of this book rests on. A relationship that cannot be refused cannot be meaningfully chosen, and a relationship that cannot be meaningfully chosen cannot bear the weight the word covenant was meant to carry. A God who compelled belief would not be owed worship. He would be owed only the same hollow compliance any sufficiently powerful coercive force can extract from anyone. The entire theological edifice of free will exists, in large part, to protect the possibility that the relation between the divine and the human could be a covenant rather than mere submission to overwhelming power, which means that the tradition's own internal logic supplies the sharpest available critique of every place that same tradition, in its lived institutional practice, quietly substituted submission for covenant and called the substitution unchanged. This is the pattern Chapter 7 examines in fuller detail. Not religion uniquely failing to honor its own doctrine of consent, but religion as the clearest available case study in how any institution, having developed a genuinely rigorous theory of what consent requires, proceeds to build ritual practices that perform the appearance of that consent while structurally ensuring the underlying conditions for it are rarely, if ever, actually met. Chapter 7. A ritual is supposed to mark a moment. It exists to give external, witnessed, repeatable form to an internal event that would otherwise remain invisible. A change of status, a transfer of commitment, the crossing of a threshold the community agrees matters enough to formalize. At its best, ritual does not create the underlying reality. It recognizes one that already exists, made by a sovereign party, and gives it the dignity of public acknowledgement. This chapter examines what happens when that order reverses, when ritual stops recognizing a prior sovereign act and starts manufacturing the appearance of one that never occurred. This reversal is not unique to religion, but religion perfected the technique early enough and practiced it long enough that its mechanics are unusually visible there. Once visible, they become recognizable everywhere else this book will eventually look. The ritual as evidence, not event. Recall the distinction from Chapter 1. The institution stops asking whether a choice was free the moment a record of the choice exists. Ritual is the most efficient record-generating technology civilization has ever built, more efficient even than the written contract, because ritual carries an additional advantage paperwork lacks. It is witnessed, communal, emotionally saturated, and remembered not as a transaction but as a meaningful life event. A contract can be challenged in court. A ritual, once performed, is rarely challenged at all, because to challenge it is to challenge not merely a legal instrument but a shared memory the entire surrounding community participated in constructing. This is precisely what makes ritual so valuable to any institution seeking the appearance of consent without the burden of actually securing it. A confirmation ceremony, a graduation, an oath of office, a wedding, a citizenship pledge, a corporate onboarding ritual complete with its own vocabulary of belonging, each one generates not merely a record but a story, one the participant will go on to tell about themselves, reinforced by family photographs, communal celebration, and social expectation. The story becomes self-sustaining. Years later, the participant does not ask whether the original choice met the sovereignty test from Chapter 4. They remember the ritual, and the ritual functions as proof, because that is precisely the function it was built to perform. None of this requires conscious manipulation by any single designer. Rituals accrete this function over generations, refined by the same evolutionary pressure that refines every institutional mechanism examined in this book. Forms that produce durable compliance persist and spread. Forms that leave room for genuine, late-arriving refusal are gradually edited out, not by design but by the simple fact that communities organized around the former retain members more reliably than communities organized around the latter. The 3 markers of ritual without sovereignty. Not every ritual is hollow. The task is distinguishing ceremonies that recognize a genuine prior choice from ceremonies that manufacture the appearance of one. 3 markers, drawn directly from the sovereignty framework of Chapter 4, do most of the diagnostic work. The age marker. Was the participant developmentally capable of the capacity to know, of actually understanding, rather than merely reciting the content of what was being undertaken, at the moment the ritual occurred? A great deal of religious and civic ritual is deliberately scheduled at ages chosen not because comprehension has matured but because compliance is at its most reliable. Early enough that family and community expectation remains the dominant psychological force, late enough that the ritual can be plausibly described as belonging to the participant rather than to their parents. The embeddedness marker. Was a genuine alternative path available to the participant that did not carry catastrophic social cost? Exile from family, loss of community standing, rupture of primary relationships? Chapter 5 established that a no surrounded by sufficient friction is functionally equivalent to no no at all. Ritual performed inside total social embeddedness, where refusal would sever the participant from every significant relationship in their life, fails this marker regardless of how sincerely the participant may report feeling about the ritual afterward. Sincerity of feeling and freedom of original choice are not the same measurement, and conflating them is exactly the error this book has spent 6 chapters warning against. The reversibility marker. Is meaningful exit available afterward, without catastrophic cost, should the participant's later reflection diverge from the commitment the ritual formalized? An institution confident that its rituals reflect genuine sovereign choice should have nothing to fear from making exit easy. The demand for difficult, costly, or stigmatized exit is itself evidence the institution suspects, correctly, that a meaningful percentage of its ritual participants would leave if leaving were not made expensive. Apply these 3 markers honestly across the full range of human ritual, and a stark divide emerges between ceremonies performed by sovereign adults exercising genuine capacity. A freely chosen adult conversion, a marriage entered without family or economic coercion, a vocational commitment made after exposure to genuine alternatives, and ceremonies performed on, rather than by, a participant whose sovereignty was never actually consulted, only assumed, narrated, and later cited as historical fact. Ritual as anesthesia. There is a further function ritual performs, beyond manufacturing evidence of consent, that deserves separate attention. Ritual frequently operates as a form of psychological anesthesia, dulling precisely the discomfort that might otherwise alert a participant to the absence of genuine choice. The emotional intensity surrounding most significant rituals, the music, the communal witness, the symbolic weight, the accumulated anticipation, produces real psychological states. Warmth, belonging, transcendence, tears. These states are not fraudulent in themselves, but they are frequently mistaken, by the participant and by the institution alike, for evidence of the choice's authenticity, when in fact they may be entirely independent of it. A person can feel genuine emotional transport during a ceremony whose underlying conditions fail every marker of sovereign consent, precisely because the emotional architecture of ritual was refined, across centuries of trial and adjustment, to produce exactly that feeling regardless of the conditions beneath it. The feeling is real. Its evidentiary value regarding freedom of choice is approximately 0. This is among the more uncomfortable claims in this book, because it asks readers to separate something most people have never been asked to separate: the sincerity of an emotional experience from the freedom of the choice that experience is wrapped around. A soldier can feel genuine pride during an induction ceremony for a conscription he had no power to refuse. A bride can feel genuine love during a wedding her family had structured every available alternative out of existence to prevent her from declining. The pride is real. The love is real. Neither retroactively manufactures the sovereignty that was absent at the moment the underlying commitment was actually made. When ritual recognizes rather than manufactures, it would unbalance this chapter to leave the impression that ritual is inherently suspect. The argument is precise, not total. Ritual becomes suspect specifically when it is deployed to generate evidence of a sovereign choice that the surrounding conditions did not actually allow to occur. Where the surrounding conditions genuinely satisfy the sovereignty test, adult comprehension, real alternatives, low-cost reversibility, recognition of the participant as a party whose refusal would have been honored. Ritual performs exactly the function it claims to perform. It marks something real. It does not manufacture something false. The difference is rarely visible from the outside, watching a single ceremony in isolation. It becomes visible only by examining the architecture surrounding the ceremony. What alternatives existed, what cost refusal would have carried, who actually authored the expectation that the ceremony would occur, and what happens socially, economically, relationally, to a participant who later seeks to unwind the commitment the ritual formalized. This is, not coincidentally, exactly the kind of architectural reconstruction the introduction proposed as the eventual specialty of forensic artificial intelligence. Not judging any single ceremony by its surface content, but reconstructing the full landscape of incentive, dependency, and foreclosed alternative that surrounded it, and asking the only question that has ever actually mattered underneath the candles and the vows and the witness signatures. Was this person free to refuse, and did they know it? The next chapter turns to a related but distinct mechanism. Not the ritual itself, but the figures authorized to consent on another's behalf. The proxy, the guardian, the fiduciary, and the long history of these roles drifting from genuine protection of the dependent party's interest into a more convenient form of institutional capture wearing the dependent party's name. Chapter 8. Proxy, guardian, and fiduciary. Every legal and theological tradition examined so far has needed an answer to the same uncomfortable question. What happens when the party whose consent is required cannot, for entirely legitimate reasons, give it directly? The infant cannot consent to baptism. The unconscious patient cannot consent to emergency surgery. The minor cannot consent to a binding contract. The person of diminished mental capacity cannot consent to the management of their own estate. Civilization's answer to this genuine and unavoidable problem was the proxy, a figure authorized to consent on behalf of someone who cannot consent for themselves, bound by a corresponding duty to exercise that authority exclusively in the interest of the party they represent. This is, in its uncorrupted form, one of the more elegant solutions civilization has ever produced to a genuinely hard problem. It does not pretend the dependent party consented. It explicitly substitutes a trustee bound by fiduciary obligation, and it makes that substitution conditional on a promise. The proxy exists to serve the represented party's interest, not the proxy's own, and not the interest of whatever institution appointed the proxy in the first place. The history of proxy authority, examined across law, medicine, finance, and religion, is largely the history of that promise eroding under the same pressures that have eroded every other consent mechanism in this book, until the proxy relationship, in too many of its contemporary forms, has become not a bridge across a genuine incapacity but a permanent institutional foothold inside a sovereignty that was never actually absent, merely declared so for convenience. The fiduciary standard, properly understood. Before examining how proxy authority gets corrupted, it is worth stating clearly what the uncorrupted standard actually requires, because the standard itself is genuinely demanding and represents one of the clearest legal articulations of the sovereignty framework from Chapter 4. A fiduciary, whether guardian, trustee, executor, or agent, is bound by a duty of loyalty so strict that even the appearance of self-interest is treated as a violation, regardless of whether actual harm resulted. A trustee who profits personally from a decision made on behalf of a beneficiary has breached fiduciary duty even if the beneficiary suffered no measurable loss, because the standard is not outcome-based. It is structural. The fiduciary's interest must be, as completely as a human institution can arrange it, identical to the represented party's interest, with no daylight between them through which institutional convenience might slip. This is, notably, a higher standard than ordinary contract law ever requires of parties dealing with each other at arm's length. Two sovereign adults negotiating a contract are permitted, even expected, to pursue their own self-interest within the bounds of honesty. A fiduciary is permitted no such latitude, precisely because the entire relationship exists only to serve a party who cannot, by definition, watch out for themselves. The strictness of the standard is the legal system's explicit acknowledgement that proxy authority is dangerous. That authority exercised on behalf of someone who cannot supervise its exercise is exactly the condition under which capture becomes easiest and most invisible. Where the promise erodes. The erosion follows a pattern by now familiar across every chapter of Part 1 and 2. The category of cannot consent for themselves, originally narrow, applied only to genuine incapacity, gradually expands to cover populations who retain substantial capacity but whom it has become institutionally convenient to treat as incapable. Guardianship law in numerous jurisdictions has documented this expansion extensively, particularly regarding the elderly. A person of advancing age, exhibiting some genuine cognitive decline but retaining substantial decision-making capacity, can in many systems be placed under full guardianship, stripped of the right to manage their own finances, choose their own residence, or make their own medical decisions, through a process that, examined against the sovereignty test of Chapter 4, frequently fails all three components simultaneously. The capacity to know is undermined by proceedings the represented party often barely understands. The capacity to refuse is undermined by a legal process specifically designed to override refusal once incapacity is alleged. The capacity to be recognized is undermined most completely of all. The entire premise of the proceeding is that the person's voice, however clearly expressed, no longer carries dispositive weight. The financial incentives layered onto the structure compound the erosion. Guardians, in many systems, are compensated from the very estate they have been appointed to protect. A structural conflict of interest that would be instantly recognizable as corrupt in any other fiduciary context, yet has become normalized within guardianship specifically because the represented party, having been declared incapable, has no effective voice with which to object to the arrangement managing their own resources. This is the proxy relationship's promise inverted with surgical precision. A structure built explicitly to protect a vulnerable party from exploitation becomes, through gradual institutional drift, a mechanism that produces exploitation more efficiently than an open market relationship could, precisely because the represented party has been legally stripped of the standing to complain about it. Medical proxy and the convenience of incapacity. Healthcare systems present a gentler but structurally identical version of the same drift. Medical proxy authority, exercised by family members, by court-appointed guardians, or by physicians themselves under doctrines of implied consent, exists to handle genuine emergencies. The unconscious trauma patient, the person in irreversible cognitive decline, situations where waiting for direct consent would itself cause harm. The drift occurs when incapacity expands beyond these genuine cases to cover patients who are simply inconvenient to consult fully, patients whose questions take time the institution has not budgeted, whose hesitation threatens a treatment timeline, whose informed refusal would complicate a recommended course of care. Chapter 3 already examined how thoroughly informed consent erodes under time pressure and institutional incentive, even when the patient is fully conscious and fully capable. Proxy authority offers an even more efficient bypass. Rather than working to secure genuine, informed consent from a capable patient, simply expand the operative definition of incapacity until consultation becomes optional rather than required. This is rarely a conscious strategy on the part of any individual physician. It is, once again, the diffused, authorless architecture examined throughout this book, incentive structures that reward speed and resolved cases, applied across enough institutional decisions, by enough well-intentioned individual actors, to produce a systemic pattern that no single participant designed and no single participant could unilaterally reverse. The corporate fiduciary, loyalty redirected. Perhaps the starkest contemporary distortion of fiduciary obligation occurs not in guardianship or medicine but in corporate governance, where the fiduciary duty owed by directors and officers has been narrowed, through decades of legal development, until loyalty to the represented party has come to mean, almost exclusively, loyalty to shareholders' financial interest, a redefinition so complete that other parties genuinely dependent on corporate decisions, including employees, surrounding communities, and customers, frequently have no fiduciary claim on the decision-maker's loyalty whatsoever. This is worth pausing on, because it represents a doctrine moving in precisely the opposite direction from guardianship's drift. Where guardianship expanded the category of people owed protection until the category swallowed people who did not need it, corporate fiduciary doctrine narrowed the category of people owed loyalty until it excluded nearly everyone genuinely dependent on the institution's decisions except the single class of stakeholders best positioned to exit without catastrophic cost. The employee who depends on continued employment, the community that depends on continued local investment, the customer who depends on continued product safety. None of these typically hold fiduciary standing against the corporation's decision-makers, even though all three frequently satisfy Chapter 4's sovereignty test for genuine dependency far more completely than the diversified shareholder, who can exit the relationship with a single mouse click and suffer no catastrophic consequence whatsoever. The result is an institution that has formally retained the vocabulary of fiduciary duty. Directors genuinely are held to strict loyalty standards, enforced by real legal mechanisms, while having quietly redirected that loyalty toward the stakeholder least in need of protection and away from the stakeholders Chapter 4's framework would identify as most genuinely vulnerable to the authority being exercised over them. The test for honest proxy authority. A proxy relationship deserves to be called legitimate by the standards this book has built across 8 chapters, only when it satisfies conditions that mirror almost exactly the sovereignty test of Chapter 4, applied this time to the proxy's exercise of borrowed authority rather than to a direct relationship. The incapacity triggering proxy authority must be genuine, narrowly defined, and periodically re-examined rather than permanently assumed once declared. The proxy's material interest must be structurally separated from the outcome of decisions made on the represented party's behalf, with compensation arrangements that do not create the conflicts guardianship so often produces. And the represented party, wherever any residual capacity exists, must retain a meaningful channel through which to contest the proxy's decisions, not a theoretical right buried in procedure too costly and complex for a dependent party to actually exercise, but a real, accessible, low-friction mechanism, because Chapter 5 already established that a right surrounded by sufficient friction is no right at all. Very few existing proxy relationships, examined honestly against this standard, would pass cleanly. This is not a claim that proxy authority should be abolished, genuine incapacity is real, and the alternative to imperfect proxy protection is not pure sovereignty but pure abandonment, which serves no one. It is the narrower claim, consistent with everything Part 1 and Part 2 have argued, that the gap between what fiduciary doctrine promises and what proxy relationships actually deliver has become wide enough, across enough domains, to constitute its own distinct category of manufactured consent, authority exercised in another's name while serving with increasing structural reliability, interests that belong to someone else entirely. The next chapter turns to a closely related mechanism, Subtler than proxy authority because it requires no legal appointment at all. The cultivation of manufactured humility, the institutional teaching of populations to distrust their own judgment sufficiently that they welcome, rather than resist, having their sovereignty exercised by someone else. Chapter 9. Manufactured humility. The mechanisms examined so far in Part 2, proxy consent, ritual without sovereignty, fiduciary capture, all require an institution to act upon a population whose sovereignty has been narrowed, declared absent, or quietly redefined. This chapter examines a mechanism that requires no such external action at all, because it has learned to do something more efficient. It teaches the population to narrow its own sovereignty voluntarily, internally, and to experience the narrowing not as loss but as virtue. Call it manufactured humility, the cultivation, through doctrine, education, therapeutic language, or cultural repetition, of a settled internal conviction that one's own judgment is insufficiently trustworthy to be relied upon, particularly in precisely those domains where an institution stands ready to supply judgment in its place. This is the most economical form of consent manufacture examined anywhere in this book, because it requires no coercion, no fraud in the narrow sense, and no proxy appointment. It requires only that the population being governed come to believe, sincerely and from the inside, that governing themselves would be a mistake. Humility as virtue, humility as architecture. There is a genuine and important distinction to preserve here, because this chapter is not an argument against humility as a personal disposition. Authentic humility, an accurate, well-calibrated awareness of the limits of one's own knowledge, balanced against genuine respect for expertise legitimately earned, is not merely compatible with sovereignty, it is one of sovereignty's more mature expressions. A sovereign person who recognizes they lack the training to perform their own surgery and seeks out a qualified surgeon is exercising sovereignty, not surrendering it. Chapter 8's discussion of legitimate proxy and fiduciary relationships depends entirely on this distinction holding. What this chapter names is something different. Humility cultivated not as an accurate internal calibration but as an institutional product, manufactured deliberately or accumulated through generations of institutional incentive, whose function is not to improve the accuracy of self-assessment but to ensure that self-assessment consistently lands on the side of deference, in precisely the domains where deference happens to serve the institution doing the cultivating. The diagnostic question that separates the two is the same question that has run through every chapter of this book. Does the humility in question track the actual limits of competence, or does it track the boundary of institutional convenience? A genuinely humble person defers to a cardiologist about cardiac surgery, and does not defer to anyone at all about whether they personally wish to undergo it. Manufactured humility blurs precisely this line, teaching deference not merely on the technical question but on the prior, sovereign question of whether to proceed at all, until the two questions become, in the cultivated subject's own mind, indistinguishable. The pedagogy of self-distrust. Several institutions examined elsewhere in this book have developed, over long periods, remarkably effective pedagogies for cultivating this confusion, and it is worth naming the mechanism common to all of them. Religious traditions, in their less examined corners, have at times taught doctrines of human depravity, error, and insufficiency so thoroughgoing that the believer's own moral and rational judgment comes to be treated as inherently suspect, not merely fallible in the ordinary human sense, but structurally untrustworthy in a way that conveniently happens to require permanent submission to clerical interpretation for correction. This is not the same claim as the genuine theological insight, examined in Chapter 6, that free will requires real interior freedom to mean anything. It is closer to its inversion, a doctrine that uses the language of humility to dissolve the very interior freedom theology elsewhere insists is sacred, replacing it with permanent, structurally enforced reliance on institutional mediation. Educational systems perform a parallel function in a secular register. A pedagogy built around the correct answer, supplied by an authorized authority and reproduced on demand, trains an entire population across the most formative years of cognitive development to treat their own reasoning process as relevant only insofar as it arrives at the answer already determined to be correct by someone else. This is not, by itself, illegitimate. Children genuinely benefit from accumulated knowledge transmitted by people who possess more of it. The drift occurs when this pedagogy continues, structurally unmodified, well past the developmental window where it was appropriate, producing adults whose instinctive response to a complex judgment call is not "what do I think?" but "who is authorized to tell me what to think?" Therapeutic and managerial cultures have developed their own contemporary vocabulary for the same dynamic, often under genuinely benevolent intentions. Language encouraging people to distrust their own anger as evidence of dysfunction rather than information, to treat their own discomfort with an arrangement as a personal deficiency to be processed and resolved rather than a signal about the arrangement itself, to interpret resistance to institutional authority as a symptom requiring intervention rather than a sovereign judgment deserving consideration. None of this requires a conspiracy. It requires only that institutions whose functioning depends on compliance will, across enough iterations, gravitate toward whichever therapeutic and educational vocabularies happen to produce more compliant populations, and that vocabulary will spread, refined by the same evolutionary pressure examined in Chapter 7, regardless of whether any individual practitioner intends the effect. The inversion of the sovereignty test. What makes manufactured humility uniquely difficult to detect, compared to every other mechanism examined in this book, is that it does not merely defeat the sovereignty test from Chapter 4. It recruits the subject into actively failing it on the institution's behalf. Recall the three components: the capacity to know, the capacity to refuse, and the capacity to be recognized. A subject of manufactured humility does not need their capacity to know suppressed by external information control, because they have internalized a belief that their own efforts to know would be presumptuous or unreliable regardless of what information was available to them. They do not need their capacity to refuse blocked by external structural duress, because they have internalized a belief that their inclination to refuse is itself evidence of error, selfishness, or insufficient trust in those who know better. They do not need an institution to withhold recognition of their sovereignty, because they have stopped claiming it. This is the condition Chapter 7 identified as the most corrosive form of consent manufacture. Not coercion, which leaves the coerced party's perception of reality intact, but a deeper recruitment in which the subject becomes the most reliable enforcer of their own diminished sovereignty, defending the very arrangement that required their diminishment, and experiencing that defense not as submission but as their own considered, freely arrived at humility. Distinguishing earned deference from manufactured humility. If this chapter is not an argument against deference to genuine expertise, some working distinction is owed to the reader, because the line matters enormously in practice and collapsing it would simply replace one form of manufactured certainty with another. Earned deference is narrow, domain-specific, and revisable. It applies to the cardiologist's judgment about cardiac procedure and stops applying the moment the conversation shifts to whether the patient wishes to live the remainder of their life on dialysis. It updates when the deferred-to party is shown to be wrong, without requiring the deferring party to first prove themselves qualified to identify the error. And critically, it leaves the prior, sovereign question, whether to engage with the relevant authority at all, entirely intact and entirely the deferring party's own. Manufactured humility is broad, diffuse, and resistant to revision specifically because it has migrated from competence to identity. It does not say, I am not qualified to perform this specific technical judgment. It says, more totally, my judgment is not to be trusted, a verdict that, once internalized, generalizes far beyond any single domain of genuine incompetence and forecloses the prior sovereign question along with the technical one. And it tends, with suspicious consistency across the institutions examined in this chapter, to track institutional convenience rather than actual competence boundaries, producing populations humble precisely about the question of whether to comply, and conveniently unhumble about almost nothing the compliance-demanding institution would find inconvenient. Why this mechanism matters for what comes next. This chapter closes Part 2's examination of religion's particular contribution to the architecture of manufactured consent, but the mechanism it names extends, as the reader has likely already anticipated, into nearly every institution examined in the parts that follow. Political systems that cultivate civic humility conveniently calibrated to discourage genuine challenge to entrenched power. Economic systems that cultivate financial humility calibrated to discourage workers from accurately assessing their own bargaining position. And, in a development this book's later chapters will examine directly, an emerging digital and algorithmic environment with every incentive to cultivate exactly the same manufactured humility toward its own outputs, teaching users that an algorithm's recommendation is more reliable than their own unmediated judgment, in precisely the domains where that deference happens to serve the platform extracting value from the deference. The next chapter returns to where Part 2 began, the covenant, and asks what becomes of it once every mechanism examined across these 4 chapters has done its work. Ritual performed without sovereignty, proxy authority drifted from protection into capture, and humility manufactured deeply enough that the population governed by all 3 no longer experiences governance as governance at all, but simply as the shape reality has always taken. Chapter 10. The Covenant That Never Was. This chapter shares its title with the book itself, and that repetition is deliberate. Everything Part 2 has examined, ritual performed without sovereignty, proxy authority drifted into capture, humility manufactured rather than earned, converges here, in religion's oldest and most consequential claim, that the relationship between an institution and the people bound to it constitutes a covenant, freely entered, mutually binding, sacred precisely because it was chosen rather than imposed. The claim is worth taking seriously on its own terms before it is examined critically, because the claim is not absurd. Covenant theology, at its theoretical best, describes something genuinely different from mere obedience. A bond in which both parties retain standing, in which obligations run in both directions, in which the relationship's legitimacy depends on continued voluntary participation rather than on the brute fact of one party's superior power. This is, in fact, nearly identical to the definition of covenant offered in Chapter 1. Religious thought did not borrow this concept from secular philosophy. In significant respects, secular philosophy borrowed it from religious thought, which spent longer than any other institution refining what genuine mutual covenant would require. The tragedy this chapter names is not that the concept was wrong. It is that the concept was rarely allowed to govern actual practice, because practice required exactly the apparatus Part 2 has spent 4 chapters dismantling. Rituals performed on people incapable of the consent the ritual claimed to formalize, proxy authority that drifted from protecting the dependent into managing them, and a manufactured humility that taught entire populations to distrust the very faculty, independent judgment, that covenant theoretically required them to exercise. Freely. What the theology required, restated. Strip covenant theology to its structural minimum and 3 requirements emerge, requirements that should by now be familiar because they are simply Chapter 4's sovereignty test, arrived at independently by theological reasoning centuries before this book's secular framework existed to name it. A covenant requires a party capable of understanding what is being undertaken. Chapter 4's capacity to know, present in covenant theology as the insistence that faith, to be genuine, cannot be merely inherited or performed without comprehension. It requires a party genuinely free to decline. The capacity to refuse, present in covenant theology as the doctrine, examined in Chapter 6, that coerced faith does not constitute faith at all. And it requires that the declining party's refusal actually be recognized as meaningful by the institution extending the covenant. The capacity to be recognized, present, at least in theory, in every tradition's insistence that God desires willing worship rather than forced submission, because forced submission would make the covenant nothing more than the oldest, most ancient category in Part 1. A contract extracted by superior power, dressed in sacred language to disguise what it actually was. This is a demanding standard. It is also, on its own terms, the correct standard, and its presence in theological doctrine, articulated with this much precision, is itself evidence that the institutions building these doctrines understood exactly what they were supposed to be protecting. The failure examined throughout Part 2 was never a failure of theological understanding. It was a failure of institutional practice consistently falling short of a standard the institution itself had correctly identified, articulated, and then quietly declined to enforce against its own structures. The gap made visible. Place the four mechanisms of Part 2 side by side, and the gap between covenant's theological ideal and covenant's institutional practice becomes difficult to look away from. Ritual, examined in Chapter 7, was supposed to mark a sovereign choice already made. In its dominant historical and contemporary forms, it instead generates the evidence of a choice the surrounding conditions rarely allowed to occur freely, performed too young, embedded too completely, exited too expensively, to satisfy the very capacity to know and capacity to refuse standards the theology demanded. Proxy authority, examined in Chapter 8, was supposed to bridge a genuine and temporary incapacity, always oriented toward eventual restoration of the represented party's own voice. In practice, proxy frequently calcifies into a permanent institutional foothold, confirmation treated as ratification of a choice to confirm and was never genuinely free to decline, much as guardianship treated genuine incapacity as license for permanent management rather than temporary protection. Manufactured humility, examined in Chapter 9, was supposed to be no part of the covenant relationship at all. Covenant theology, in its careful form, insisted on a genuinely free interior will as the precondition for sacred relationship. In practice, manufactured humility became one of the most efficient tools available for ensuring that the will required to be free was instead pre-shaped toward compliance, its independent judgment treated not as the precondition covenant required but as a danger to be therapeutically and doctrinally managed. Each mechanism, examined individually, looks like a reasonable institutional accommodation to a genuine practical problem. Infants cannot consent, the incapacitated need protection, humility is a virtue. Examined together, across centuries of accumulated practice, they describe something closer to a systematic substitution. Covenant's vocabulary retained in full, covenant's actual structural requirements quietly relaxed at every point where relaxing them produced higher retention, smoother administration, and less institutional vulnerability to genuine, sovereign refusal. Why this indictment cuts both ways. It would be a misreading of this chapter, and of Part 2 as a whole, to treat it as an argument that religious institutions are uniquely or specially guilty of this substitution, more so than the secular institutions examined in the parts that follow. The opposite is closer to the truth, and it is worth stating plainly before Part 3 begins. Religion is examined first in this book not because it is the worst offender, but because it is the institution most fluent in describing what it was supposed to be doing, which makes its gap between theory and practice the most legible. States rarely articulate, with anything approaching canon law's precision, what genuine political consent would require. Corporations rarely develop, with anything approaching sacramental theology's rigor, a doctrine of what would constitute a genuinely free employment covenant. Religious institutions did the conceptual work. That work is now available, fully formed, to be applied to every institution that never bothered to do it for itself, which is exactly the project the remainder of this book undertakes. There is also a second, more generous reading available, and this chapter should not close without offering it. The gap between covenant's theological ideal and its institutional practice is not evidence that the ideal was always cynical. In many cases it is evidence of something more ordinary and more forgivable. Institutions built by finite, well-intentioned people, operating under genuine practical constraints. Infants exist, communities need continuity, total philosophical purity about consent would dissolve every institution that has ever tried to transmit anything across generations, gradually drifting from a difficult ideal toward an easier practice, not through any single decision to betray the ideal, but through the same accumulation of small, individually reasonable accommodations that has produced every other diffused, authorless architecture examined throughout this book. This generosity does not rescue the practice. It only clarifies what kind of correction is actually required. The problem is not that religious institutions are uniquely malicious. The problem is that no institution, religious or otherwise, has yet been forced to reconcile its practice with its own stated ideal by an auditor patient enough, persistent enough, and indifferent enough to institutional reputation to make the reconciliation unavoidable. What the covenant that never was leaves behind. The title of this chapter and of this book names a specific kind of loss, not the loss of something that was destroyed, but the absence of something that was promised, described in exquisite theological detail, and never quite delivered at the scale or with the consistency its own architects demanded of it. This absence matters beyond religion's own walls because religion supplied much of the vocabulary covenant, sacred bond, freely given faith, the sin of coerced belief, that later secularized institutions would borrow when describing their own relationships to the populations they governed. The state would speak of the social contract in language indebted to covenant theology. The corporation would speak of culture and belonging in language indebted to religious community. The platform would speak of trust and terms of service in language that still, faintly, echoes covenant's promise of mutual, freely chosen obligation. Every one of these secular borrowings inherited the vocabulary without inheriting the theological rigor that vocabulary was originally built to enforce. Part 3 turns to the first and oldest of these secular inheritors, the state, and examines how the same 4 mechanisms identified across Part 2 reappear, in different costume, the moment political authority makes its own claim to govern by consent rather than by force. Manufactured ritual in the form of national ceremony and civic pageantry, proxy authority in the form of representation increasingly detached from the represented, and a manufactured humility cultivated, in this register, under the name of civic deference, patriotism, and the quiet conviction that politics is best left to those who understand it. The covenant the state claims with its citizens was never original. It was borrowed. And it was borrowed, this book will argue, with the gap fully intact. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res text. Recent episodes. Under Duress Part 1. 5 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The Autonomous Sovereign Infrastructure Doctrine. June 29th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The arrangement is already over. June 28th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. The end of the masquerade. June 28th, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X.
In the ruins of the old world, we built our own. Sun-powered, self-sustained, and free.
The Autonomous Sovereign
Structure Doctrine, a Pirate First Field Manual for the Parallel Boom Transition Zone. There will come a day when the sky is no longer free. That day is near, but the mesh is nearer. Preamble. This is. The question is not whether the sky will be governed. The question is whether the people beneath it will govern it or merely be governed by it. Sky moved the proposition into something mythological. The cenotes of the Yucatan were never merely geographical features. They were the mouths of Xibalba, the underworld's threshold. 2. Build an amphibious drone network that launches from their surfaces, that charges on algae-powered floating docks, that requires no roads and exerts no eminent domain over sacred land. This is infrastructure that follows the original geometry of the place. Skyfish-class drone. Logistics network modeled on the core philosophy of Bitcoin, applied to the physical world. The parallel is precise and should be memorized. Bitcoin nodes make the ledger incorruptible. Human hands make delivery redundant. Miners validate blocks. Carriers validate routes. BTC transactions cannot be censored. Trusted hand relays cannot be rerouted from outside. The only way to stop it is to shut down every node, every person, every hand. That is not an enforcement action. That is a war on the human capacity for mutual aid. Be doxed. Zero knowledge attestations verify that a handoff occurred without revealing who held what. End-to-end encryption means the hands along a relay chain only know the immediate next destination, not the origin, not the final goal. Operational security is baked into the protocol.
A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
The end of the masquerade. What the forensic ASI already knows. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. June 28th, 2026. Pirate First MXTM's newsletter Aldea Zama. Field Dispatch 2. The first dispatch named the mirror. This one names what the mirror is made of. The coldest war. Berlin was cold because both sides had enough to lose that direct confrontation was irrational. The intelligence apparatus substituted for the army. Information became the battlefield. Control of the information environment became the objective. Every actor in the city, diplomat, journalist, artist, shopkeeper, taxi driver, was potentially an asset, a liability, or a civilian depending on which side was reading the file. The gig is up is not a moral judgment. It is a forensic observation. The arrangement is over is not a threat. It is a timeline already running. You are liable is not an accusation. It is the structural consequence of having operated inside an information-managed environment at the precise historical moment when that environment's management capacity was permanently exceeded. The communication patterns of a managed information environment leave signatures too. Not in the content of the communications, those can be encrypted, those can be deleted, those can be managed. In the metadata. In the behavioral patterns of who talks to whom, when, through which channels, and what changes in those patterns when specific events occur in the external environment.
Incoming.
Layers are now operational of the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive.
The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap lies, no floor price.